Welcome to the Making of Man. My name is Matthew Rodriguez, and today I'm joined by Dr. François Sarah as we discuss the works of Louis de Bonald. Dr. François is a lecturer and a researcher at the African Leadership University, and he is also an avid player of what I've been told is the vicious game of croquet. In today's discussion, we are going to go through one of the works specifically of Louis de Bonald. Louis de Bonald was an author, a thinker, and an orator throughout and after the French Revolution. And although our general environment may look a little different than his, the principles of governance that he lays out, I think, are very impactful to what it means to govern in general, which means to govern as the head of a family, as a father and a husband. In addition, Bonald is part of a collection of authors that really serve as the font of traditionalism in terms of more modern governance. And in this discussion, we're going to talk about how Bonald argues for the monarchy, but it's really an understanding of human nature, of the necessity of governance, and the discussion of what it is necessary for governments to actually do. And that trajectory goes far and wide past Louis de Bonald into other authors like Joseph Pieper and others that you may have heard of. So whether you are a father looking for better ways or more ways to lead your family, or just someone who's interested in political theology and traditionalism, this conversation will have something for you. Okay, Francois, so we have Louis de Bonald. We have him kind of writing in a relatively turbulent time, but I wanted to hand it over to you. We can have a little bit of context about that time that he was living with, and then dive into his ideas and his commentary on it, really, as he wrote over a pretty extensive period of time.
Yeah, indeed. He actually had a very, well, for the standard of 18th and 19th century, had a long life. He was born in 1754, and he died in 1840. And basically, he was born under the reign of Louis the 15th, and he died in the reign of Louis Philippe, which was after the French Revolution. There was a restoration, and then there was the two brothers of Louis the 16th who got beheaded, and then the cousin who basically introduced a constitutional monarchy. And of course, Bonald was sort of distraught because he was against the very idea of a constitutional monarchy such as it was introduced in France back then. So he was born under the what you could call the royal absolutism that was established actually at the end of the 1400, under the reigns of French kings, Louis the 11th, Louis the 12th, and that was consolidated by Louis the 14th, who was the Sun King, the builder of Versailles, basically everything that we identify as French culture, as the acme of European culture, was created during that time. So he was born under basically royal absolutism, and he died under a constitutional monarchy. And in between, he passed through the French Revolution, the Napoleonic regimes, and the Restoration. And he had high hopes for the Restoration, actually, none of which came to pass. So that's basically the sort of timeline of Louis de Bonald, 1754 to 1840. He was born as a as a viscount in the family of a viscount. Um, Basically, the nobility, not the very high nobility, but sort of middling nobility, and in the southern province of France, where basically he was basically born at the limits of a sort of area that was always debated between France and Spain.
Mm.
Okay, and you had Toulouse and you have Lourdes, all those, that area in the south of France. And at the beginning, well, a little note. So most of the nobles in the military in France during the monarchy were drawn from the nobles. Most of the officers, most of the petty officers and everything were from the nobility and the high bourgeoisie. And so they all had to to pay what they call the service of blood. They
Mm.
had to serve their country by shedding their blood, and they didn't get anything in return. They only got military glory and that kind of thing. That was the. And Louis, he joined the Musketeers. And for those who like the Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan, and all that, so he was part of that regiment, and he was actually part of the last batch, because I think the regiment was disbanded when he was still serving. So he was like, I like to think of him as the last musketeer, and the defender of the realm in a way. He defended it with his sword, with his musket, and then he defended it with his pen,
Mhm.
and later on with his word, because he was an orator. He was a member of the House of Peers during the Restoration. So why are we even talking about Louis de Bonald today? It's he could have ended his life as a provincial gentleman, looking after his estates and not minding the high business of politics. And yeah, we would not have been, giving us the opportunity to talk today. So, like many nobles, Bonald welcomed the first breath of the French Revolution because he believed, he thought, and he hoped that it would bring much needed change, much needed reforms in the government of France. Unfortunately, this did not come to pass. The French Revolution, such as it was, became an attack on the previous regime, became an attack on the monarchy, and an attack on the church. So for most of 1789, and 1790, Bonald was a part of the provincial administration, and he was trying to see, well, what could be reformed, what could be improved in the public infrastructure. He was very publicly minded, and he was trying to use. He thought he could use the revolution as something to bring the betterment of his locality, of his
Mhm.
province. He was very much like he would have been a federalist. You see, he would have been in favor of, at that time. I mean, he would have been in favor of his, what would be effectively his state,
Mhm.
if we were to use the American equivalent, because a province was more like a state with a legislature and everything, and a sort of system of government at the local level. And he was part of that. Unfortunately, he saw that the excesses, the violence that occurred at the revolution, he saw that his colleagues in the province and from Paris, they had no intention of basically stopping the violence, and that they were actually doing everything they could to increase it and to worsen it. And so for him, that was a kind of first, something's going wrong there. Why are they not basically pacifying? Why are they not having recourse to basic policing power to prevent, violence against landowners, violence against public officials, etc., etc. And the second thing that basically that was decisive in his total rejection of the French Revolution was the civil constitution of the clergy, which was passed in circumstances that were really, really, I would say, that were terrible. I mean, I use the word terrible knowingly because the king, Louis the 16th, he hesitated to sign that civil constitution of the clergy for the good and simple reason that it effectively gave the new revolutionary government total and utter control over the church and over church property, basically. Basically, from one day to the next, the whole of the church property was signed over to the state. Okay, so we need to I will pause here and do a little backpedal. So we need to remember that in France, in the Ancien Régime, the ancient regime, which was the royal government, the royal administration, it was a very much a devolved affair. So there was the royal administration and there were the provinces, but then there was also the estates. There was the first estate, which was the church, the second estate, the aristocracy, and then the third estate, which was basically the commoners. But effectively, the commoners were headed, the third estate was headed by merchants, bourgeois, sort of lawyers, and that kind of. And Burke, actually, in his reflections on the French Revolution, he actually quite outspokenly identifies the that element of the third estate. So the church was the first estate, and I think that says a lot of the priorities of the old French government, the spirit of the French. But I like the French royal constitution. That says a lot about it, and it takes us back to the very beginning of the baptism of Clovis, the first French king in a way, the Merovingian, and how Saint Remy, Saint Remigius of Reims, he was instrumental in basically creating the French monarchy. And it was a saint, and Saint Remigius himself, he came from he was not a Frank, he was not a Germanic, unlike the king, and he came from a mixture of Gaul and Latin, Gallo-Roman. He was a Gallo-Roman, and so the whole history of the French state was deeply intertwined with the church. The church literally brought. Was the midwife, you could say, of the French kingdom.
Well, there's the phrase, right, where France is the eldest daughter of the church.
Exactly. France was the eldest daughter of the church, is the eldest daughter of the church, and the French king used to be the first canon of honor of the Lateran Basilica in Rome, which is the Pope's cathedral in Rome, and the French king used to be the first canon of honor. In the 20th century, the French president has tried to claim that status, and I believe that one of them actually went there and sat in the canonical stalls.
That's funny.
That's
well,
funny.
I remember at the reopening of Notre Dame, I remember that he tried to make a speech inside the church, to which the public outcry was saying that's one step too far, and so he did it from the stairs, which I thought was pretty funny.
Exactly, exactly. So that
So,
so and that the since De Gaulle in 1958, the French president has sort of tried to posture himself both as the executioner of the French monarchy, but also as a successor.
mm-hmm,
There is something in that which is
mm-hmm.
the deep schizophrenia of republicanism in many ways. So,
Which
and
I'm sure Bonald would not be surprised by, right?
oh no, he diagnosed it. Actually, he
Yeah.
diagnosed it. So Bernard, um, he so after he refused to take the because all officials had to take an oath to the civil constitution of the clergy, not just the clergy. And obviously, Bernard, as the president of his local administration, he refused to do so. As the mayor of his president of a local administration and mayor of his village, he refused to do so, and he was proscribed. Basically,
Mm.
they set a target on his back. He had to flee in exile. His property was confiscated. His wife and daughters went into hiding, and he took his sons with him first to Switzerland, Germany, and then England.
Mm. Okay. I wanted to ask. I wasn't sure if his family was with him when he was in exile or not. So they kind of split in two ways.
So
Okay.
the because there was this presumption that the revolutionaries would go after the males and try to get rid of them, and would
Mm-hmm.
not care so much about the females, and therefore the females were left behind in hiding to sort also of to prepare for an eventual return, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and to sort of get things ready in the case that and Bernard did return in 1794 or 96, I believe he returned, but he had to go incognito. He could not sort of
Mm.
declare who he was, and he was very much in hiding most of the time, because there was a proscription
Mm-hmm.
um, sort of attainder against him.
And while
Uh,
he's in exile, is he able to communicate with his wife and
yes,
daughters? Okay.
yes, he's able to communicate, and that's also when he's writing. He's writing his first
Okay.
book, The Theory. The Theory is a fascinating book. Actually, the title says it all. It's the theory of political and religious power on the basis of reason and history. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and so basically, his two sources in that book uh, is reason and history. That first book. So there was the theory of political and religious power, and there was an annex to it, which was the theory of social education, because he was also someone who wrote at length on education. That those two works came out as a single edition in 1796, and as soon as it came out, it was impounded by the government. The revolutionary government. It was impounded. There was no, like, they didn't allow him, the chance. But interestingly, while the wider public did not have access to it, people who would later on become mainstays and supports of the Napoleonic regime had access to it and were actually influenced by it, deeply influenced by it, in the way in which the Napoleonic regime, well, the Napoleonic regime didn't go the way that Bernard would have expected it to go, as basically preparing for the return of the monarchy, preparing for the return of the king by putting a stop to the excesses of a revolution. But in certain aspects of it, the Napoleonic regime betrays a kind of awareness of the principles of political constitutions that Bonald would express in that work. One of the people who actually read the work was someone who would become the education minister of Bonaparte, of Napoleon, Fontaine, and he would be the one who would sort of help Bonald maintain kind of relationship with Napoleon. You know, Bonald was it's like Plato going to Syracuse to convince I can't remember the name of that tyrant to become a virtuous ruler kind of thing, and the tyrant took him and put him into slavery.
Yeah.
Sold him off into slavery. It's like, yeah, you're not going to convince those thugs. Yeah, it's like, but it's the same kind of like, you know, speaking wisdom to power in a way. So that book came out in 1796, and it was from the perspective of the history of ideas, the history of the French Revolution. It is a landmark. It is a landmark because it is in a way, the first book that doesn't mince its words. It's not trying to be like, you know, Burke in his reflections on the French Revolution. He's very outspoken about the French Revolution, but he's trying to say, well, there are some revolutions that are actually good, like the Glorious Revolution of 1688, 89, which was a good revolution according to Burke. And the French Revolution should have sort of tried to do the same kind of thing. And Bonald was like, no, no, there is no such thing as a good revolution. And that work is basically trying to take apart everything that the revolutionaries set up. So, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the civil constitution of the clergy, and all the revolutionary legislations and attempts at creating a French society on the basis of a revolutionary thought. And Bonald was saying, well, what you're doing, you're just literally, you're just monkeying with the lives of people. You're just monkeying with society. Monkeying is not a good word, but like you're playing with it. You're dabbling. You're doing something which you're not supposed to do. Societies have a life in and of themselves. Societies actually are beings, and made up of other beings. And he would go very far with that. So the first, I would say, the starting point of that theory, you tell me when I should stop, because
No, I mean, I think
tend
this
to
is
drone
great.
on. So
I think this is great. Yeah, I was also struck by, there was a phrase that you used in your thesis, of like political theology, which was kind of a new subject to me. Obviously, I've heard of, you know, the theology of people as individuals and the makeup of that, but Bonald's uh, discussion and description of societies in a theological concept, I thought was very interesting. And maybe this would be a good place to get into some of the ideas of the theory. And specifically, if we could walk through, from what I understood, kind of the three-part community, or the three communities that kind of meld in a hierarchy, where you have God, right, who, you know, is kind of all contained within himself, but then obviously kind of spills over in love to create man. Then you have the community of man, which is imperfect. And I thought as well, in this idea of political theology, thinking about societies as beings and what the ramifications of the fall are to that. I thought that was an interesting thing that Bonald brought in. But man is this imperfect society where there will be friction, will be tension, if there's not a larger governing body that kind of is able to settle some of those disputes. And I like the phrase again that you had in your thesis, and it might have been taken directly from Bonald, but where you said that Rousseau and some of the others argued whether government was voluntary or forced, like oppressive. And Bonald's answer, again, maybe to go back to your idea of not mincing words, he says neither, it's necessary. And
Very.
so I thought that was a great idea. So maybe we could just walk through that
Mhm.
kind of quickly of, you have
Yeah,
God, you have man, and then you have these societies of man that are necessary as a ladder kind of between man and God.
definitely. I mean, this is again, this goes back to the very to the introduction and to the first part of the theory, um, which is like the revolution starts with the vindication of the natural rights of man. Bonald starts the work of the deconstruction, because that's very of the revolution, with a vindication of the rights of God. Now, of course, people may ask themselves, well, why start with God? Especially in today's world where basically we do not think of the public realm, we do not think of politics, we don't think of society in terms of God. We have this very sort of, in some states, it's very rigid, like in France, you have the separation of church and state.
Mm-hmm.
In America, it's a bit of a, we don't know.
we
Right?
people
It's
people think that it's more rigid than it really is. So yes.
right. In the UK, for example, we have a kind of confessional state, but with a church that has been created by the state, and basically the state creating the religion that suits itself in a kind and legitimizes itself in a kind of way. Okay, I hope I'm not straying into like the beer hall aspect of this. Yeah. But and Bonald is saying, well, no, we need to start from the beginning. And I would like here to bring attention to actually another author who comes before Bonald in England, Sir Robert Filmer. And it is something that we will go back to Bonald, obviously, but I need to remark on that. So many classical liberals, or liberals in general, American liberals, British liberals, they would refer to Locke's second treatise on liberty, right? Now, that is all well and good, but there was also a first treatise. And the first treatise was directed against Robert Filmer. Robert Filmer, he was a thinker. He was also he was a politician, but also a thinker, who basically derived royal authority directly from the Bible. So for him, kings rule in right of Adam. Okay, and that was basically one of the defenses of a Stuart monarchy in the UK, of Stuart absolutism. And John Locke was trying to criticize this, I would say, biblical, but also natural theory of monarchy by appealing to the old Hobbesian idea of the, well, it's not specifically Hobbesian, but Hobbes was the one who gave it the most articulate expression of the state of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that state of nature, the very idea of the state of nature, it is very interesting to see how both Hobbes and Locke define it. They define it as a state of war of all against all. They define it as a state of without authority, I think, for Locke. And for Rousseau, it is basically, and Rousseau would take it further and basically say that, look, the state of nature is the opposite of the civil state. And Bonald is having none of that. He's like, this is introducing the wrong idea of nature. This idea of nature that we have from the contractarians, from the liberals, basically Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, is an idea that basically paints nature or society in terms of a kind of duality. Either it's all good or it's all bad, and therefore we derive a political theory on the basis of that, instead of basically understanding, well, what is nature? What is nature, and what is the place of man?
Mm-hmm.
What is the vocation of man, of human nature, and so on and so forth, and the relation between nature and society. So with all these authors, we have the idea that society is something which is not natural, which is something which is the result of human will.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea is deeply problematic in the sense that it does not acknowledge the inherent sociality of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It posits a kind of individual human being that comes into the world as a unit. Whereas this is actually not the fact. That we may come into the world as a physical unit, but that doesn't mean that this physical unit has no relations.
Mm-hmm.
So for Bonald, the idea of relations, relationality is fundamental. That
Mm-hmm.
is, the human being is someone who is born with relations, and therefore he's a deeply social, inherently social being.
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean to vindicate the rights of God? Well, it is to recognize that basically that sociality comes from God. So that's why Bonald has this kind of tripartite ontology,
Mm-hmm.
theory of being, which is like a being has love, will, and power. Okay? And God, being the perfect being, being the being that is above all beings, he wanted to have something other than himself to love, to cherish, to preserve. And therefore, that's how creation came to be. That there was something other than God that God could look upon and love. And at the pinnacle of that creation is man. Why is man at the pinnacle? Because again, man has been created in the image and in the likeness of God. And therefore, man is capable of entering into society with God. So there is it's not just a matter of God in the excess of the ecstatic love of God creating something other than himself, but also positing something in that otherness with which he could enter into a relation. And that being a special relation, and that being is man. And already there we have this sociality, we have this community of God and man in the backdrop of creation. Creation being the ecstatic outpouring of God's love outside of himself.
Mhm.
So, yes, sorry. Do you want to?
No. I'm just following along.
So, and therefore, here we have man who also has basically love, will, and power. Now, back to God. So, God, not only does he create the world, but he also wants to preserve the world. He wants the world to continue to bask in the love that he has for the world. Now, human beings also have the possibility, not just of that they don't have the possibility to create, but they have the possibility of reproducing, of generating other human beings. And that generation of human beings will be the condition for the creation of human society, of the human community. And that is at the basis of all human communities at all the different levels, from the society to the state. Now, human beings are endowed with the capacity not only to produce other human beings, but also with the capacity to preserve other human beings. But for Bonald, it's like the family as the unit, as the very base of all other human community, is eminently the family, the community of production,
Mhm.
the production of other members, the production of the idea of God in the minds of the children, and the community, and very importantly, I think in the background of Bernard's thought, that's my commentary here, but I think this is very important. Community of production of the means of subsistence was a big part, because time and again Bernard speaks about the family as having a vocation of self-subsistence,
Mm.
of material independence. This is fundamental, and when you started, you mentioned that in the American society you have a kind of pathway that you're meant to take. You go to college, you take a loan, etc., etc., and the state basically leaves you alone if you do that, while keeping IRS happy and that kind of thing. And well, Bernard would see that as basically we've been turned from producers to consumers.
Mhm.
The model that of the model citizen that the state expects us to be today is that of the
Mhm.
consumer of everything that the market produces, because in a way the state is it's become the state of the market more than
Mm.
anything else. So and therefore there
And
is.
and you can see how this kind of diffuses into how people think about families. Where I just this past week, I saw someone kind of talking about if they were going to get married or have a kid, and they said no, and they said they're going to have dogs and stuff like that. And their two reasons for this was it's cheaper and it's better for the environment. And I thought that that was very interesting. And like, I think in Bonald's perspective, and definitely in the church's perspective, those two things don't even really come into play when you think about having kids, right? When you think about this generative force of the family, it doesn't matter if it's cheaper. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if it's kind of has these external effects that some people are worried about now, because it's for the production of the family. That's the main goal. It can't be substituted with anything else. And so I think that's very interesting to see how the state of the market, or the market of the state, like you said, kind of shifts down. And we were talking earlier, humans today kind of define themselves against economic means. I think it's interesting that the flourishing of the state is determined by the GDP of the state, which has nothing to do with the actual like happiness or virtue of the people that are in the state. And then now you're finally, which I think this is kind of the end result, is if enough people take this family mindset on of it's too expensive, so I'm not going to do it, then the state doesn't endure ultimately, right? I mean, it it
Yeah.
might take a while, but it's like the math just doesn't work that way. That if you don't have kids, the state can continue to thrive. So
Well,
I think it's very interesting to see this and contrast it with Bonald.
absolutely, and that tells us what kind of state we have nowadays. Uh, Basically, there's something that happened to the state which basically derailed it from that function of preservation of society. And I think this should basically point us towards, trying to see how futile partisan politics is,
Mm-hmm.
how totally pointless in a way the kind of dichotomies, pluralistic politics of democratic states is, because at the end of the day, if no party is committed to the preservation of not just the citizens as individuals, but of the families of citizens, then what are they doing?
Mm-hmm.
Why are people following them? What? What?
Mm-hmm.
What? Like what? What? What?
And
What?
so is that thinking about the function of the state as this way to protect the family against maybe some of its um,
Well,
darker inclinations, is that kind of where like the monarchy and the state kind of takes its form?
well, the monarchy, in many ways, what is the monarchy? So, what the problem is that when we try to apprehend the issue, the question of the monarchy from the perspective of today's state, of course we will ask ourselves, well, where does it come in? What's the added value of the monarchy to the state as it is now? Because we have a sort of self-contained structure that rests on a hierarchy of norms, but which is like a circular hierarchy of norms after all. Because if you try to say, okay, why this law? And then they will tell you, well, because there is another law that enables it. And then there is another level of law. And then there is another level of law until you arrive at the Constitution. But then when you arrive at the Constitution, what is a Constitution in the modern understanding? What is it? The Constitution, like what most jurists for the past 200 years have called constitutions, are nothing but articles of government. They are not constitutions as such. And it is such a usurpation of that word to apply the term constitution to basically articles that govern the arrangements of government power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what should be a constitution? So that brings us, back to Bonald, in the sense that for Bonald, you cannot there is no human power that could promulgate a constitution for a state. Each state, all states, have a natural constitution, which means that that natural constitution actually rests on those two powers of production and preservation. The family is the agency of production, and the state is the agency of the preservation of those agencies of production, of generation. And so, because of that familial adjective of family, family-based understanding of society, there needs to be an embodiment of that. There needs to be an agent of that. You would notice that in Bonald, everything is a matter of mediation. Man is the mediator between God and the creation. Man is also the mediator. Well, a man is the mediator between God and humanity, Jesus Christ in his humanity. And the king also is the mediator between God and his specific kingdom. So what is kingship then? What is the monarchy? So for Bonald, again, it is a matter of necessity. It is not a matter of will. It is not something that we have to decide. There needs to be an agency in the state that will make decisions for the preservation of the state when needed. And, like we'd make peace and war, that will make mint money, and will decide on the policy of the state. So there needs to be an agency, and that agency cannot but be, in a way, I will use a swear word in today's world, cannot but be a patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And a royal patriarchy at that.
Mm-hmm.
So the king is not just like the ruler of a state, but he's himself the head of a family, the head of the first family of the state, which ought to give the example of virtue, again, which ought to basically be the model family in many ways. We know how that has gone in the past, but at the same time, we've had examples of virtuous kings that have left an abiding stamp. I'm thinking of Saint Louis. We are in the world of Louis. Saint Louis, he's like, how can St. Louis not be the hero of Catholic fathers?
Yeah.
It's like in today's world. How can
Him
St.
and
Louis not be...
Ferdinand III as well.
And Ferdinand III, yes,
they
exactly.
rank high.
Well, exactly. So, like, how could those kings who have given the example of virtue, the example of basically care for their kingdoms, care for their subjects, concern for justice, how could they not be models for today's Catholic politicians, be they in a republic? So I think that yes, so we go back to God, creator of the world and maintainer of order, because anyway, order is the will of God, right, which becomes for us creatures necessity, right? And of course, that necessity has to leave a space to our free will, either to conform to that necessity or to rebel against it. And so for Bonald, whenever there is a deviation in the constitution, whenever man pretends to create a constitution for the state, it's a deviation from necessity. It is basically, yes, if we, of course, we are in Augustinian. We are in the greater realm of Augustinian thought, Augustinian, I would say, philosophy of history, and Augustinian theology. And of course, there has been a lot that has been said, in my own tribe about Augustine. But I think that is very much the result of 20th century kind of critique. But anyway,
Mhm.
so we are in that realm of basically what the French Revolution did was basically trying to overturn something which is natural, and by doing so going against the will of God, against the order defined by God for the state, for the family, for the human being. But Bernard has got a interesting sort of understanding of history in which whenever such a thing occurs, God will make things basically go in such a way as the natural constitution will be restored.
Mm.
There is a, or if, and that is very important, or if basically the wickedness of man is such that the natural order of sort of benevolent kingship is not restored, monarchy will be restored, but in a punitive way. Such monarchy as could decree a planet-wide um, uh, pandemic, and that kind of thing, and this is still monarchy, and that's the thing that people don't realize, and I think it partakes of the blindness of the age, which is that for all the talks of democracy, for all the talks of liberalism, liberal order, and that kind of thing, ultimately, in all governments, in all structures of decision making, there will always be someone who will make the ultimate decision, who will be empowered with the ultimate agency. And in a way, we could argue, if we're going with the Augustinian trope, that we do not deserve to have a benevolent king that we would recognize as someone who's making the decisions, and instead we're having this kind of hazy, we don't really know what is going on over there, and which all of which feeds into weird fantasies and perpetuates this sort of delusion, society-wide delusion, civilization-wide delusion. And I think this is exactly, in my opinion, and I don't think I'm straying too far from Bernard in saying that this is the times in which we're living right now. And where we don't know, we think that we know, we think that when we're voting for the agency, for the preservation of society. Actually, we should ask ourselves the question whether we do so in reality, or whether it's something else entirely. So I don't want to go too far on that road.
Yeah.
Because
Well, and we can bring it back to the monarch, but also it's interesting when you were talking about kind of how Bonald says, like, in every government, no matter what form it takes, someone ultimately, be they on the surface in the form of a monarch or buried deep within a bureaucratic structure in terms of some of the more representative structures that we have, someone kind of has the agency to make these calls, right? And it was actually something that I was thinking about as well as I was preparing for this conversation, even in terms of the Constitution, right? You mentioned earlier that the Constitution is kind of this circular framework of laws where eventually everything kind of goes up to the Constitution, and then we stop it there and we say, that's satisfactory. We've gone back to the beginning. But what I think is interesting is that ultimately the Constitution was written by men, right? So it's this interesting thing that almost, at a certain time in a constitutional government, there was, a lot of agency to write whatever the Constitution is. The Constitution is written, and then almost that becomes like the year zero kind of going forward, and everything else just refers back to the Constitution. When in
Yeah.
effect, I mean, I think you can make an argument that taking the American political system, there's probably someone in some bureaucratic place that has like this agency or whatever, but almost in effect, the people that still had the agency to make the decisions that we're carrying out might go back to actually just being the founding fathers, right? And we are just continuing, to minister to what they are or have created. And so I think that that's just a very interesting thing where we forget that ultimately the documents that we hold sacred today, although, I think that there could be arguments for their importance,
Oh,
ultimately
of
were
course.
created by men, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
I mean, a caveat here is, obviously, n- like I'm not putting in doubt, or I'm not, I'm not, I'm not questioning the fact that in many so-called modern constitutions, you have provisions that appear to serve the common good or the preservation of society. But again, given the the way in which there is no stable policy, there's no stable government changes, etc., etc. Well, you could always query the intention wherewith those provisions are enacted, are applied. And of course, this is a conversation that in our liberal democracies we really do not want to have, the conversation about intentions, intentionality, and finality. What is the finality of government? What is the so those are the questions that we really want to avoid, and we sort of get stuck into
mm,
processes, and and we forget that. So one of the authors that I sort of study in the prolegomena of my thesis is Carl Schmitt. And for me, Carl Schmitt is very important, as much as he needs to be taken with with pincers. Okay, so he was a Catholic. He started as a Catholic, but then he started as a very brilliant jurist, right after the First World War. Basically, well, he was already a jurist, I think, during the war, and he was recognized as one of the most brilliant jurists of his generation. And then he was dealing with the Weimar Republic, which was basically, the Weimar Republic, where it was a very unstable regime, and all governments of most governments of Europe were exacting reparations from Germany, and at some point Schmidt became a Nazi, and but I think that Schmidt's writing from his pre-Nazi phase are the writings that I refer to, and those writings are very they give you an insight into all that we've just been discussing about the the weakness of liberal democracy from the point of view of the claims that liberal democracy makes about
mhm,
itself. And he's got this Political Theology 1, a short book, which I would recommend, and where he says, I think the first sentence is, sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception.
Ah, yes,
Sovereign
I've
is
heard
he
that
who
much
decides.
quoted.
Yes, you've heard that. And
Yes.
that is something that is fundamental to us nowadays in this kind of, we like to think that the West has created this rules-based world order, right?
Hmm.
And when you bear in mind that saying of Schmidt, that sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, well, I could almost just shut up here, because when you think of the exceptions to that rule-based order, that supposedly the great defenders of liberal democracy accommodate themselves with, Abu Ghraib, prison, Guantanamo, and all those things that have been going on. That not just the Americans, sorry, because I don't want to put a target on your back,
That's okay.
but also the British, also the French, all those sort of post-revolution liberal democracies have perpetrated in the 19th and the 20th century in the name of liberal democracy and human rights. It really sort of leads you to take all of it with a not all of it, but to take the intentionality behind all that rhetoric with a huge grain of salt.
Hmm.
So, and I think that sort of fits in with always a continuation of the critique of Louis de Bonald that he leveled at. Yeah.
Well,
So.
and thinking of that and going to the monarch specifically,
Mhm.
I think some people, where we're used to a representative, we're used to looking at government and seeing many faces, right? You see a whole bunch of people. Um, to think of just one person in that role, and then of course their ministers, I thought the logic that Louis uses to get to one person being the necessary holder of like the general love, the general will, and the general
Yes.
power was an interesting thing. That it really does need to one all be in one. The same, at least the same unit has to be responsible for the preservation with the love, the will, and the power. But then that unit itself should be one man. And
Yeah.
so I was wondering if you could walk people
Yeah. Yeah.
through, how he gets there and how it's again kind of more pushing in this argument of that preservation being in the monarch, that maybe a more representative or partisan government wouldn't necessarily be able to contain within itself.
So again, we go back to, I think it's something which is very important, and I think I use in my thesis title, analogy, right? And I think I wrote the thesis a while ago, and yes, social analogy, I think. Sorry, I'm trying to retrieve my file. This is bad.
No worries.
Um, so I was interested when reading Bonald, but also reading Bonald and Schmidt by the whole idea of analogy, right? So analogy is basically the kind of same relation at different levels, right? So we have God, who is responsible for the preservation of the world. We have the king, who is responsible for the preservation of his particular realm. And we have the father, who is responsible for the preservation of his own family. And therefore, there is this kind of idea of analogical and overlapping hierarchies in
Mhm.
Bonald. And that idea is precisely what we mean by political theology. Political theology is that outworking of that analogy of the different hierarchies of God, king, and man. Now, to come back more specifically to your question, the idea here is that when we talk of the general love, the general will, and the general force, that general love, general will, and general force, it could never be something that is dispersed in a number of agencies. It has to be concentrated in one agency, but that doesn't mean that it cannot delegate. Okay? And I think this is a very important notion here, which is in a way, the mirror opposite of the idea of representation, right? In the sense that you vote for your congressman and your senator to represent you in the organs of government, and where they make decisions that are meant to be for your own good, right?
Mhm.
The other one, of course, is basically so that model is bottom up, or ought to be bottom up, right?
Right.
And the other is top down, because ultimately everything comes from God down to the king and down to the head of the family. And in this way, Bernard basically he simply adheres to the word of St. Paul, where in the epistle to the Ephesians, and in, well, Catholic, Orthodox, and Scripture, right? And if you had a Protestant friend, you would know on the tip of his finger. And so where St. Paul basically enjoins us to obey the king. Now,
Mhm.
again, this notion of obedience is very key here, because that obedience is what basically disciplines the will of the king, disciplines the loves of the king, and disciplines the power of the king. So the king here is not some kind of arbitrary monster, that tyrant that is unleashed on society and can do whatever he wants. Yes, there isn't the idea of the rule of law, if we understand by law the expression of the will of the people, but there is the idea of the rule of law as the law being the expression of the will of God.
Mhm.
Now, ultimately, this goes back to the fact that even the king is not proprietary over society. He's not the proprietor of society. He's not the owner of society. Society has been committed, his own little realm has been committed to him by God, for him to be the agent of God.
Mhm.
Bonald, but this is where it's very important, I think, because this is not the whole story. Because for Bonald, there is political society, but there is political power, political will, but there is also religious society, religious power, and religious will. And God is only, I would say, perfectly worshipped on earth as much as is possible, not just in political society as a hierarchy of king, minister, and subject, but also in the and that's very important here, even though I'm expressing myself terribly badly. God is also worshipped perfectly in the conjunction of the political society with the religious society.
Mhm.
Because inasmuch as a political society only caters after the body, the religious society caters for the soul and the spirit, right?
Mhm.
And therefore there needs to be this union of the two societies. And this shows us the extent to which Bernard actually formalized the constitution of any Christian state. And he shows that the true sovereign of that Christian state could only be the God-man. Jesus Christ is king. So, and Jesus Christ is the true king. It is from Jesus Christ that the kings of the earth hold their kingship. And more specifically, in Christian kingdoms. And so for Bonald, therefore, that conjunction of political society and religious society creates what he calls civil society. And that is the, you could say, the highest degree that human society could attain to on this side of heaven. And
So
again, as much as Jesus is very God and very man, the society that is capable of the worship of God through Jesus, because Jesus is God anyway, so is the one in which religious society and political society are united, in as much as the human nature and the divine nature are united in Jesus Christ. So that is, and in one of his later writings that was discovered in the 20th century and published actually 10 or 12 years ago, Bonald goes at length on this almost Christological parallel analogy between society and the two natures of Christ.
That is very cool. So to summarize kind of the constitution of society as we have been discussing it in comparison to the constitution of our modern societies. So the society proposed by Bonald starts with the logic of God and says that he is one and in himself contains perfect will, power, and love. Because of his perfect love, he wishes to love an other, and with his perfect will and perfect power, that ends up in creation, with the pinnacle of creation being man, who is especially the love of God, right? It's the special relation of God. In mediation from God to man, there comes the God-man in Jesus Christ. And in a continuation of that, in a, I guess you could say like temporal continuation, you then get that broken into two different governing structures or two different mediating
Societies.
structures. Yeah, okay, societies. One being the political state, which is headed by the king, who mediates the will of God and the will of Jesus Christ to the bodily, the fleshly portion of the community, the political society. And the other society would be the will, or would be mediated by the bishops in the Catholic Church, specifically led by the Pope, which mediates the more religious society of Christ. But both kind of commingle when they get into the actual citizenry of the civil society, which the civil society itself is built up of fathers and families. And those fathers then kind of almost integrate both of those societies, the political and the civil. The father kind of reintegrates that to their family in raising both politically obedient and kind of conscious family members, but also religiously obedient and conscious family members. Is that a general synopsis?
Yes, I think this is great. I was just going to add a last thing, which is the father is the head of the family and the high priest of the domestic church. So, and that is fundamental to not just Bonald, but Bonald in the tradition of the understanding of traditional understanding of family, which is the father is the priest. I mean, when I say priest, I don't mean it in the sacramental sense of ordination and all that, but that the father is he's the one who offers the prayers of the family, and in a special way that I'm not saying that God doesn't listen to the prayers of mothers. On the contrary, I think mothers have been on their knees more than the fathers have in history, and
Yes.
but there is something very special with the prayer of the father, and even more so the prayer of the father with the whole family, rightly ordered, father, mother, and children. So, but not just like a nuclear family, because bear in mind, Bonald is not having in mind the modern nuclear family. So for him, he's really looking at basically a clan, you know? And when
Mm.
he says that the family needs to be independent, needs to, and that the material aspect of the society of production, this is not just like mother, father, and children, but like grandfather, uh, patriarch, and different generations living together, as we still see in the Middle East and in
Hmm.
other parts of the world. And we really need to ask ourselves the questions why that model of the family was basically discouraged and eradicated in the West. And
Hmm.
I think if we have an honest look at that, it might enlighten us about the other issues in the West as well.
Yes.
So
Well, well, I was just going to say one thing that I've been thinking of as a recent husband. There's a lot of decisions that come in life, and it can be hard to find a guiding priority to make those decisions, right? But when you put the benefit of a child, whether it's a hypothetical child or a child that you actually have, as the center point of which you then make all your decisions around, which, I would argue that's not a bad way to do it in a family. As you mentioned, even in Bonald's understanding, the family is in charge of the propagation of life, of creation in that way. And so when you make the child the center point of all your decisions, I think it really does radically change how you view all these different aspects, of life, and even to what you're saying there, which I think makes a lot of sense. And it's almost unfortunate that with what feels to me like a first generation of in the West, specifically in America, in my community, of Catholics who are rediscovering these values, we hear, the family should be kind of materially independent, and we say great, but the only family that we kind of have that's in on that mission is like our nuclear family, right?
yeah.
And so then it almost overloads the responsibility of the nuclear family when father and mother kind of feel this pressure to, bring in income for the household, potentially make all the food for the household, stitch clothing for the household, all these things that, might be involved in that material self-sufficiency. So it makes a lot of sense if you think about it in terms of a broader community, where potentially you could have, grandma and grandpa stitching jeans, and and your
Absolutely.
other brothers out in the farming or whatever. And
Yes.
then yes, as a family, you are then materially sufficient, which doesn't hopefully overload anyone specifically.
I think you're quite right here, and in many ways, my generation, your generation, I think we are called to be pioneers in that regard. We are called to basically. I think that the sacrificial road is going to be trodden by us, and in many ways, and in spite of all the odds. And I agree. like I'm not saying that from the perspective of basically posturing as posturing us as victims, but certainly the structures of the market and of politics do not make it easy for that vision of the independent family uh, to take reality. And you're quite right. And but again, this should ask us to perhaps reorient our political action, and or even not even having to wait. For full disclosure, at one point I was part of a kind of endeavor of Benedictine oblates to try to put in effect the vision of not just of Saint Benedict, but Saint Benedict a la Rod Dreher, the Benedict
Hmm.
option.
Yeah.
Does that ring a
Yeah.
bell? It's so 2015, I suppose.
No,
Benedict
that still gets
option.
passed around.
And it is, well, I'm glad in a way. So I have this deep commitment to Saint Benedict. And there was a feast of Saint Benedict on Friday on the Gregorian calendar. Friday, I think, the 21st, yes. So yesterday. And I think we need to, I think Saint Benedict still, I mean, people will disagree and say, well, he was breaking from the world and he has his specific monastic and eremitical vocation. But I also think the way in which that he's created his monastery as a family with the abbot as a father, this is something that ought not to be rejected as a potential model, and in my mind, I've always with the people with whom we were discussing and trying to set something up, it was a kind of vision to have this a small religious community of Benedictine monks, and then some families living around with land in common or something like that, and trying to go back to something that resembled the villages that sprung up around Benedictine monasteries in France and in England.
Mhm.
But many challenges for that, and I haven't given up entirely on this. And as I'm discerning myself, my vocation, whether it is to be to the religious life or to the
Mhm.
headship of a family. So this is yeah, it's a lot of soul
Yeah.
searching in that.
Yeah. Well, no, I completely agree, and I'm actually really interested in that endeavor. I'd love to connect after on that and just learn more about it. But I think that, like you say, as we are the first generation, we're the pioneers. I could almost foresee um, the larger organization that we're talking about kind of growing out of the experience that all of us are going to have, specifically thinking about fathers as heads of our family, right? This is really the first organic governance that most of us will really have. And in many ways, it's the most important organic governance that many of us will have. And then you could almost think of it again. It's funny because it is kind of bottom up in a way that Bonald might have looked a little askance of, but it's if you first understand correctly the vocation of fatherhood, then you can more accurately understand a higher level organization that basically takes the same view, right? If as a father you understand that your family belongs more to God than they do to you, and you are the minister of God to ensure their flourishing, I think it's a very small step in that sense to then go, okay, I'm now the mayor of a town, and the town belongs to God more than it belongs to me, and I'm just the minister of its flourishing.
Exactly,
And the
exactly.
previous Archbishop of New York, Fulton Sheen,
Hmm.
had a quote that I loved where he said that civic craft is an outgrowth of parentcraft, which I thought was, it just kind of speaks to this kind of where instead, again, I think today that we kind of view like you learn how to lead in a business, right? Or you learn how to lead in some other endeavor, and then you have that other stuff with your family, right? And it's
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
no, no, no. It's
It's
like
such
I
a
learnn how to lead with my family, and then
exactly
yeah, maybe I manage some people in a business, but
exactly.
it's not the same. And so I know that we're coming up on time here, and so potentially as a an ender, although I'll pass it over to you if you have anything that you want to continue with. There's
I
a
think.
quote. Sorry,
Sorry. No. Carry on.
no. There's a quote from Charles Paguay that I don't know if you know of him. Okay, I'm pretty sure he was writing post all these revolutions.
Yeah.
But yeah, but he said this quote that has stuck with me. There is only one adventurer in the world, as can be seen very clearly in the modern world, the father of a family. Even the most desperate adventurers are nothing compared with him. Everything in the modern world, even and perhaps most of all contempt, is organized against that fool, that imprudent, daring fool, against the unruly, audacious man who is daring enough to have a wife and a family. Everything is against him, savagely organized against him. Everything turns and combines against him. Men, events, the events of society, the automatic play of economic laws, and in short, everything else. Everything is against the father of the family, the pater familias, and consequently against the family. He alone is literally, quote unquote, engaged in the world, in the age. He alone is an adventurer. The rest are at most engaged with their heads, which is nothing. He is engaged with all his limbs. The rest suffer for themselves. In the first degree, he alone suffers for others. So I just thought that was a very, again, interesting quote that kind of speaks to what we're talking about here, and potentially the importance of the role of a father, not only in rediscovering what it means to lead of our families, but also what it means to rediscover what it means to lead in a more governmental kind of society, in a civic society, as Bonald would say.
Indeed. Well, that's two great quotes from Fulton Sheen and from Charles Péguy. I think this is probably Fulton Sheen. I'm sure he must have been a reader of Bonald. Wouldn't put it past him. He was
I
such
can
a
imagine that.
well-read, he was such a well-read person, and Péguy certainly he was as well, because it was in the air of the time as well in France with the Action Française and all that. Um, I think those two quotes are spot on. The family men, family fathers, they are the yes, they are the they have a target on their back. They are the no, seriously. I mean, when you think of when you look at what you said, I think about how when we are teaching leadership, and I mean this is very relevant to my own situation at the moment. When teaching leadership, we're always starting from venture capitalism. Basically,
Hmm.
we're looking from the perspective of the entrepreneur, and we forget that the as Peggy would say, that the most daring entrepreneurs today are family men. Men and women who decide to create a family together under the hand of God. So yeah, thank you very much for this interesting conversation.
Of
I hope the
course.
first of others.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it became very evident to me as we were talking and as we were making our way through when I was looking at the time that we've only really summarized one of four works and only one concept of many concepts.
That's right.
So so I would be happy to pick this back up again at some point.
Yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm actually planning to sort of publish a book on burnout. It won't be based on my thesis, but it will certainly there will be some overlap.
Awesome.
and hopefully by the end of next year, it should be coming. And where I would, it's sort of trying to express Bernard's thought without getting too much into the weeds of scholarly uh, discourse and
Hmm.
controversies, and basically trying to just articulate. And there are actually a few English editions of some of his works. I think Imperium Press has published, and some others as well. I think Ave Maria University, they had some works of Bernard out. And I actually approached Cambridge. You see, Cambridge University Press, they have this, what is it, series on political texts, history of
Mm.
political thought. And I approached them. I said, would you be interested in a text of Bernard? And I received a very curt reply saying, no.
That's funny.
So that was in 2017 or 18, I think. So yeah, and
Okay.
yeah, that was. If I may say something,
Hmm.
I started university in 20 in yeah 2008, right? And I moved to St Andrews in Scotland in 2012, and I could literally see the progression of the culture change in the
Hmm.
student body from 2012 to 2018.
Hmm.
It was, the it it was a shock to
Hmm.
see that like you see, St Andrews is one of those universities which is sort of old universities and all that kind of thing. And there was still a remnant when I just arrived there. There was still a remnant of, like, uh, of the old culture. And by the time I left, the new culture, or lack of, was in full display.
Yeah.
And but I think the tide will change. And with pioneers like yourself and like others, countless others, Uh, let's hope that, well, we can still hope. Hope is, my late supervisor would say that hope is not a political virtue, and but hope certainly is a theological virtue, and
Hmm.
that's what matters.
Hmm. Yes. Well, and yeah, I think that there's definitely room for hope. I think that we are at a shifting point in terms of the broader culture. I definitely agree with you that, yeah, from, you know, 2008, even maybe a little bit earlier, up to 2024, was a wild a wild change in culture. That even if someone agrees with it all, I think that they would agree that they felt like they were having to catch up. Like I don't know if that's ever really happened to the same degree. Well, I mean, I can imagine the French Revolution was very similar, but like in an organic situation, I don't think that you should ever feel like you have to catch up to the culture. It should just be something that kind of everybody changes at the same time. And so
Yeah,
it was very interesting, and I remember trying to explain certain concepts to my parents and being like, yeah, like I actually don't really understand it all that well, but like this is kind of the line that we're walking. Like this is what we all agree on, at least, even if I don't necessarily understand it. And so, just having that experience, I think most people, even if they're all in, would agree that they kind of have to feel like they have to read up and catch up and do all that.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think we're finally at a
Yes,
time when,
unfortunately. Sorry.
yes, no, yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think that we're at a time when
Oh,
it's gone as far in some cases as I think it's going to go.
hmm.
So we'll see.
Yes, we'll see. We'll see. But I think that all those authors, Bonald, de Maistre, and all that, they do give us, like again, we were talking about hope, but also this providentialist notion of history that
Hmm.
uh, and that it can go only so far, and there is the whole uh, divine government of history, divine government of time, which hopefully will set everything to rights. And even though we have to keep digging from where
Yes.
we are. So,
Yes.
right.
Well, on that note, we can end this conversation. Like you said, hopefully the first of many. But thank you so much, Francois, for
Thank
having this
you. Thank you,
discussion.
Matthew.
And I will see you again next time.
So